Let me greet every one of us this morning. Let me say, Sanbonani, Dumelang, Goeiemorgen, Bondea, Molweni, Thobela. Welcome this morning. Welcome to each and every one of us this morning. And if you are coming for the first time to One Hope, please receive it from me. Welcome. We enjoy having visitors around. We thank you that you took time to come and worship with us. Others know we had to force you to come this morning. We know you. Don't look the other way. We know you because you are not coming to church. Goeiemorgen. Rale dumedisa. Bazalwane, our greatest pleasure, as we always say, is the high point of worship. We can sing, we can pray, but the high point, it is when we come together and open God's word together so that we may worship. Because the whole essence of worship is to know who God is. The whole essence of worship is for God to make us more and more like Jesus Christ. For that is the whole point of why we become saved. Therefore, this morning, if you are coming for the first time, please do not be worried, do not be perturbed. We are currently studying through the book of Exodus. Exodus in the Old Testament. And what we are seeking to learn is how God speaks throughout all generations. The book of Exodus is a very important book because it's very descriptive in demonstrating to us what salvation is. If you want to understand salvation, read the book of Exodus. Because in the book of Exodus, God demonstrates that He's a redeemer and He's also a deliverer. And because He's a redeemer and deliverer, that is the whole main purpose or the whole theme of the book of Exodus. And if you study it, I've said it even before, for those who are new, Exodus can be seen in different ways. And one of those is you can look at it from a geographic perspective. I've said this before, that from chapter 1 to chapter 13, we find Israel in Egypt. And from chapter 14 to chapter 18, this is where Israel finds itself in the wilderness. And from chapter 19 to the end of chapter 40, Israel is standing on Mount Sinai. Or they find themselves on Mount Sinai, where God would now be able to speak to His people and to give them His law. If you want to look at it from a different perspective, also, if you study Exodus, you're finding how then God would bring out the children of Israel on this Exodus, which is from chapter 1 to chapter 18. And from chapter 19 to chapter 24, this is where God is giving the children of Israel His law. And from chapter 25 to chapter 40, this is where God now instructs them and makes them to build the tabernacle. So from when they are building the tabernacle, after God has given them His law, their laws are for nothing else but to help or to guide them in how to worship. But for where we find ourselves, one of the key chapters of Exodus is chapter 20, where God now calls the children of Israel into a covenant with Himself. And as he gives the covenant, he gives these laws that we call the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are what we can also call the moral law. But in keeping them, the children of Israel will demonstrate that they have now entered into a covenant with God. A bilateral covenant with God, where God himself will have an expectation on them, and them in return can have an expectation from what God would do for them. We said in chapter 20, it's also an extension of chapter 19. For in chapter 19, we see how God brings all of them before the mountain and he speaks to them. I'm still astounded by this idea that everyone during that time heard the voice of God. That is amazing. That if you were a child of Israel, whatever age that you were, God called you to stand before Mount Sinai so that you can hear him speak to you. So this was not secondhand. When you read about the 10 Commandments, it's not secondhand. It is God himself speaking. We said if you want to understand the laws themselves, the first three pertain to God. They speak about God. How God says that you need to know if you are going to worship me, what kind of relationship can we enter into? And we said the first relationship, you must know that, know God's worship in the way that I've described. And not only must you worship in the way that I've described, also worship on the dedicated day that I've described. Last week we studied from verses 8 to 11 where God said to them, as part of my covenant, learn to rest. Learn to rest. Keep the Sabbath. Having said that, that's why we find ourselves this morning on the second part of the book of Exodus, on the 10 Commandments. We are studying now from the 5th commandment. And we'll only do the 5th commandment today. It reads thus: honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. From here onwards, from the 5th commandment up till to the end, rather than now God seeking about how people may have a relationship with him, God now gives the commands in how the relationship with people must be regulated. Observe with me again. Unlike the first three, and just like the 4th one, this commandment is given as a positive. It is not given in the negative. What do I mean? It is not a do not. That's why I've entitled my message, The Prescription to Honor Parents. The prescription to honor your parents. Why is it a prescription? Because this is a positive demand from God. It is not a negative of do not. And once you look into honoring your father and your mother, this commandment, it is as broad as can be and non-specific as can be. And to whom is it directed? We can be assured that the intended audience is to all children. All children. And when it says all children, it speaks of children irrespective of age. Children irrespective of maturity. It says to all who know that they have been born to parents, it speaks to you. Whether you are mature or not, this prescription says this is a demand on you. Because it is not age specific. It says even that you are a child. You are now independent from your parents. This prescription also applies to you. It says, even if now you are no longer under your parents' home, this prescription speaks to you also. So therefore, it's got nothing to do with whether your parent is there or not. There's a certain thinking that God says to the children of Israel they are to have when they think of their parents. Look at the text. It says, honor your father and your mother. When it says honor, it says that word honor, it means about something heavy or something weighty. You know the difference between weight and heavy, right? Heavy is a rock. A rock is very heavy. But sand is weighty. So then it says to every child, when you are to think of your parents, think of them as heavy. Think of them in your attitude as weighty. So it says to every child, there has to be this level of respect and honor and reverence that must be given to one's parents. So it says, when every child thinks of their parents, they are to have this attitude, this behavior that sees and gives value to their parents. It speaks of when parents not only speak, but also in how they comport themselves. Their children, when they look at their parents, they are to have this kind of attitude that says how important they are. Because we said this is in the positive. It speaks also, if we will look at it, that when the children think of what the words of the parents are, they are not to take them lightly. Look with me in Leviticus, the book to the right. Leviticus 20, verse 9. This is in the context of God says, this is how I make you holy. This is verse 8. He says, if you keep my word and you do them, he says, I am Yahweh who sanctifies you, who makes you holy. And how does he? He gives you the explanation of how God, if you're a child in Israel or you belong to Israel, how do you say? He says, this is how you will demonstrate that you are holy. Here's an explanation. For anyone who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. He has cursed his mother or his father, his blood is upon him. That word to curse is not how you think about it. That word to curse is to take somebody lightly. It is not to esteem them. It is not to give them the value and the honor that is due to them. That's what it means. It means when children were to look or to hear what their parents were like, they were not to treat them in a trifling manner. Abakhatali. That's what it means. Abanandaba. These are the type of children who say when they look at their parents, they don't see value in them. So these are the type of children, when they think of the legacy of their parents, they say they've got no account. So when they think of them, their parents, and if you are to look into an account, it means that the parents have zero in their account. You know that's the people who live like that, right? Who, when they look at their parents have got zero. But their friends and the world are the ones who could wait. I will not listen to my mother or my father, but I will listen to whoever that the trending or the influencer says. Because the influencer has got more weight. And the reason why, if you look into it, if you look into Leviticus, it tells us the reason why it is such children in Israel deserved death, because they belittled their parents. This word to honor again brings this attention to us that when people have got this reverence or this attitude and behavior, it is an attitude and behavior that is divine reflective. What do I mean by that? It is reflective of the kind of attitude that is given towards God. We studied this. Let's look it up. Let's remind ourselves in Exodus 14, verse 4, just to remind us. This is how then God speaks about Pharaoh. When Pharaoh thought about God, and this is what God says, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, that and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, and they did so. Look at verse 7 again. He says, let's leave it. I want to show you this. This is what God is saying. Through Pharaoh, God will find or be honored. God will be glorified when he then comes and brings his judgment on Pharaoh, who did not care about who God is. Remember in chapter 5, he says, who's Yahweh that I must obey him? This hey. So God says, this word says, when you are giving him honor, it says, this is how I get glory. That's what it means. I agree with another commentator here who says, that word to honor, it means it is, if you are not honoring him, you are having, your parents, you are having an attitude of disrespect. You have an attitude of contempt. You have an attitude that does not show the genuine, true worth or value of your parents. So he's saying every child must, in a sense, use a language that when they think of their parents and when they are thinking about them also, they must afford them the due honor and the respect that is to be given to parents. And here's another, and to all authority. Because in a sense, this verse is also about authority. Because where do children first get to meet authority? At home. That's why one man said, if you're not willing to live by this law, then you will meet the law of the stoop or the law of the cement. What he meant by that was, those who have got disrespect and are contemptuous towards authority either end up in jail or they end up dead. Because when children do not show their respect, when they fail to honor their parents, it means they despise their parents and they find their parents to be unworthy. You are not worthy. You are not worthy that I must hear you. And we have seen that what is the penalty that God said was due to any child in Israel for such a disrespect. It was death. But from this prescription, see again that when God says, if such an attitude is held, there is a reward, there is a motivation regarding why you are to have such an attitude of honor and respect. Look at the text. This is the why. So that your days may be prolonged on the land which the Lord your God gives you. The idea of prolonged days, it's many days, but it's about a time period. God says those who have such an attitude towards their parents, they would be rewarded. Their years of life will be stretched out. By the way, it's not saying that you are not going to die. You might not die as a teenager. It doesn't mean that. It says those in Israel, if you are to do this, there will be the sense of security that God himself will grant. By the way, if you see with the Lord, we said this Lord is the God who is real, the God who exists. That's what you need to know. That L-O-R-D in caps or Yahweh is the God who's genuine and is real. So it's not a make-believe God. Remember I've spoken about it. I said, people, when we talk about the God of the Bible, they are thinking that the God of the Bible is the God in the book. No, this is not the God in the book. The book is the one that belongs to the one who wrote it. But because he wrote it, it demonstrates what that waphila uyaphila. And when he says your God, it talks about the one who is superior. That's what the word God means. The superior one. The one who's above. So we can say what the reward is to the children of Israel. We can say this: their survival in the land was predicated on the value that they placed on their parents and on authority. Remember, the land was given to them not as a reward. The land had been given to them graciously. It was by grace that they would occupy the land because God gave it to their progenitors. God gave it to their forefathers. So therefore, it wasn't because they deserved the land. It was just an act of grace. So God says, in my gracious granting of the land, for you to continue and to survive in the land, have a proper respect towards authority. And why would he keep this word? Because God is a covenant keeper. And because God is a covenant keeper, you can trust him that he will not betray you. He will not turn against you. He will not change his word against you. For those who believe his promises. It's a short verse. But what does it mean, Bazalwan? It means that every child, when they have an initial encounter in Israel at home, was always to be the first person. The mother and the father were the first point of contact of authority for every child of Israel. And therefore this authority had to be honored. It had to be respected. It could not be denigrated. It could not be held lightly. Parents had to be esteemed highly in Israel.